Welcome to Skwat Talks. Tonight we're going to be talking about the 80-20 rule, otherwise known as the Pareto Principle, and talking about how that may or may not apply to your training. And we'll talk a little bit about minimalism while we watch me do what I would consider to be dynamic effort work with my squat. I'm doing some squats with doubled minis band work, and yeah, I work up to, I think, 10 or 12 sets of singles, doubles, and triples with 225 with the doubled minis. So maybe you're familiar with the Pareto Principle, the 80-20 rule. There for a while there, it seemed to be really gaining a lot of popularity in the fitness community and in the running world. People were applying what is known as the 80-20 rule or Pareto Principle to their training. The idea behind Pareto Principle is the idea that 80% of results come from about 20% of your work. And so Pareto, I think, as an Italian economist, was looking at land ownership, and he noticed that 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the population. And then people started to apply that to different things, and people have used that as a way to look at training, that 80% of your gains come from about 20% of your actual work. I think that as a training concept, this idea of the Pareto Principle is a good one. I think as a general rule of thumb to look at your training, it's a nice idea as a concept. I'm not real sure how useful it is necessarily, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. I think some of the pluses of looking at your training through the lens of the Pareto Principle, one of the useful ways that you can use it is if you are someone who really has no idea where to begin, if you have no idea your plan of attack, that thinking about things in terms of the Pareto Principle can be helpful. So if you have, for example, a jigsaw puzzle to figure out, I think most of us would agree that you generally start on the outsides of a jigsaw puzzle. And then if you worked the outsides of the jigsaw puzzle and then you worked on the major visual images within that jigsaw puzzle, you'd probably have about 80% of the puzzle done, really. But then you'd have to look at those individual areas, like the dark areas that don't have a whole lot of different shades and colors, and the ones that are more difficult to distinguish. You have pieces that all look exactly the same. Those are the finer pieces that you would then have to go back and iron out. But as a general rule of thumb, for most of us, that idea of getting the outside, just the outside border, and then working on those major pieces is going to get us most of the results that we need, and then we'll spend a little bit more time on those finer details. I think that the Pareto Principle, thinking in terms of those larger pieces in your training, is good. The higher yield stuff is good. It encourages you to put your energies into the right things. It makes you realize that there's a lot of things that are maybe only marginally useful to your training. So if I look at, for example, my training, the major things that I think add to my strength in the squat would be, for example, squatting. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Probably some of the other things like deadlifts, glute ham raise, those would also be probably considered, for me, I'd probably consider those to be the high yield activities that I do for squatting. Some of the other things like mobility work, maybe some of the prehab work that I do, some of the stretching that I do, don't have quite the noticeable impact maybe. And so those would be some of the things that would not go into that initial 20% that yield the 80% of gains. So I think that as a way to look at your training and to decide what are the high yield things, I think that's a really useful exercise for people. I think it's a good way to frame your training a little bit. The problem with that, I think, is that when people look at things in terms of the 80-20 rule, that if they prioritize the 20%, maybe the other 80% of activity, they're giving the short end of the stick. They're not giving that the attention that maybe you really need to give it. So those smaller pieces, although they are smaller, and maybe they don't give you the yield that some of those bigger pieces do, that doesn't mean that they're not important. If we're, for example, I don't know, building a fence, the boards and the planks all make up, 80% of the fence, but the other 20%, the nails, for example, are that's a small piece of the fence, but they hold the fence together. So sometimes I wonder if we're maybe sacrificing some cement if we put all of our effort into those major high yield things, and we tend to look past some of the smaller, finer detail things that may be holding the whole thing together. Synergy is something that I think is really important. We look at each of the individual parts, and if we're looking at some of those major pieces, maybe we're missing some of the smaller pieces that by themselves aren't so meaningful, but in the mix they have a larger role to play. One thing I think that it bothers me a little bit about the whole idea of thinking about, well, this is a high yield exercise versus this is not a high yield exercise, is that I see people who are talking about training a lot, and they're putting all this effort into their training, but they won't work on some of those smaller, finer details. But then when you look at their diet, for example, they don't hesitate to buy this supplement, or maybe they choose to use this particular supplement or that, when really I think most of us would agree that a supplement, unless it's steroids, it's probably not giving you a huge yield, and yet they're really picky about that small, minor detail. That's one of the things one of the critiques I have of people who take kind of a minimalist approach. It's like they're trying to cut the fat from their workout, but at the same time they worry about seemingly insignificant details in other areas of their recovery or training, when really the major things are maybe not as covered as well as we would think. One other thing I would say about this 80-20 rule is, if you're looking at a recipe, and we could look at how you cook a squat, I think, and we could use that analogy for a lot of things. If you're cooking food, and I was thinking about this the other day, when I make lasagna, for example, I have a lot of ingredients that go into that lasagna. I have the pasta, of course, there's tomatoes, and then there's cheese, and there's several kinds of cheese. There might be hamburger, I might have onion, garlic, pepper, salt. There's a lot of ingredients. Mushrooms, for example, and there might be other vegetables that I might decide to throw into that lasagna. Spinach sometimes, if I'm trying to add some green to my lasagna. But I add a lot of ingredients to that lasagna. Now, what are the high yield items? What are the 20% of the items that give me 80% of my lasagna? Well, I suppose, let's say we have 15 ingredients. The top three, I guess, would be the pasta, the tomatoes, and maybe a kind of cheese or two. Can I make a lasagna with just those three things? Yeah, I suppose I could make a lasagna with just those three things, but would it be good lasagna? I'm not so sure. I think that you need all of those ingredients to come up, or most of those ingredients, to come up with an acceptable lasagna. And when it comes to training, I would say the same thing, that if you're not including a lot of those ingredients, you might not be getting the dish that you want. And so when we're looking at training, I would say that I would encourage you to not always be looking at a minimalist approach. I say this often to to people who are willing to listen, sometimes less is not more. Sometimes less is just less. And so I would encourage you to try different things. I would encourage you to see how combinations of exercises and workloads produce different results. I think that, again, that idea of synergy is an important one when it comes to training. I do believe the Pareto Principle is useful as a tool, as a way to kind of think about your training and maybe put priority towards certain exercises, but I think that we can lose sight of some of those smaller details. That's what I have for you on the Pareto Principle. Let me know what you think about the Pareto Principle or the 80-20 rule and how you've decided to use it in your training. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Skwat Talks.